Adoption Roadmap listeners, it's podcast editor Josie here, and today marks our 99th episode. Can you believe it? We are so grateful for every listener who's joined us on this journey. And guess what? Our next episode is the big one, episode 100. After that, we'll be taking a short summer break, but don't go anywhere. We've already lined up some incredible guests for season 3, and we can't wait to share what's coming. Stay tuned, and thank you for being a part of this amazing community. Now, on to the episode.
And you can't focus on this all the time, or you're not. I mean, kids are kids. They're also just being children.
Yeah.
It's very important not to ignore any of the issues that are there as a matter of adoption. But it's also not very good to make them the forefront and talk about them all the time. I think it's a very complicated situation for adoptive parents. I think if adoptive parents are well educated themselves and aware of all of this, they're the experts on their child. So they'll know how to, and if you had 4 children, you'd have 4 different approaches. So I don't think anyone can tell you what to do, but other than just keep yourself really well informed, well aware, check yourself when you feel strident about something, or when you just be open to what's going on and to how a child is responding to certain things or acting out around certain things.
Welcome to the Adoption Roadmap Podcast, your go-to guide through the beautiful, complex, and transformative journey of adoption. I'm Rebecca Gruenspan, a single mom through adoption consultant for over a decade, author of the Adoption Roadmap book, and your trusted guide. In each episode, we dive into real experiences, expert insights, and the raw, honest truths that you will need to navigate your journey. Whether you're just beginning, in the thick of it, or well past placement, you'll find support and community here to help you navigate this unique path with confidence and love. Adoption isn't all rainbows and butterflies. It is life-changing and worth every bit of effort. Let's learn, grow, and journey together on the Adoption Roadmap Podcast. Have you ever stopped to consider what it truly means to heal from adoption, not as a problem to fix, but as an experience to understand and embrace? Today's guest is a living legend in the adoption world, someone whose groundbreaking insights have shaped how we understand adoption, not just as an event, but as a lifelong journey. For over 5 decades, Dr. Joyce Maguire Pavao has championed the mental health of adoptees, families, and the professionals who support them. As an adoptee herself, her pioneering book, The Family of Adoption, introduced us to the idea that adoptees experience predictable developmental challenges and deserve lifelong support and understanding. Dr. Pavao famously coined terms like family of origin and living in the adoption triangle, shifting the narrative from secrecy to openness, from hidden grief to honored complexity. She urges us to hold space for all parts of the adoption story, pushing back against the myth of adoption as something to be fixed. Instead, she reminds us that real healing happens through listening, community, and a deep commitment to the truth. Get ready for a powerful conversation that challenges assumptions, honors complexity, and reminds us that adoption isn't just about forming families. It's about supporting them every step of the way. Welcome, Dr. Pavao. I'm so happy to have you with us.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Rebecca.
Absolutely. Let's start with one of your most quoted lines from The Family of Adoption. You say, adoption is not about finding children for families, but about finding families for children. And I love that that came out of your book, because I've been saying that to my families for years. It's one of the very first things that I say to them that I think just helps them with a bit of a mindset shift. So I'd love to hear from you what that phrase means to you and how this mindset shift supports both hopeful adoptive parents and adoptees.
Well, I always feel that it's hard to do this, but all of us need to keep children as the centerpiece.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say that when people say in the best interest of the child,
Mm-hmm.
whether you're in court or you're working with an agency or whatever, everyone always claims to be doing it for the best interest of the child. And yet, most professionals are really looking at a particular adult, and that's their client. So it's hard to keep the focus on the child, especially when they're not born yet, or when they're an infant, or when they're 6,000 miles away in another country and not with you yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the more we can put the child as the centerpiece, the more we can build families that are going to be more solid and they're going to work in a better way. It's very hard for the adults involved, both the birth family, first family, and the adoptive family, to put their egos aside, because they both have issues also and losses that they're contending with in the midst of adoption. So it's to me, it's really important to keep the child as the centerpiece.
I love that. And I also think I tell my families, if you are the best parent for that child, it's going to be the best match for everybody. But you might not be the perfect match for a particular child. And it's all about the child, like you said, at the center. So I just love that you had also said that. And I probably learned it from you somewhere along the way. But you also write about the concept of normative crises in adoptive families. So what are those exactly? And why do they show up even in the most well-adjusted adoptees in supportive homes?
Well, it used to be that people would try to make everything as if. When you adopt, it's going to be as if you gave birth to this child. It's just going to be fine and dandy, and there's no difference. Or if you are placing a child for adoption, you're going to get on with your life, and it's going to be as if this difficulty didn't happen along the way. And if you're an adoptee, it's going to be just life as usual. And none of that is true. Adoption, from the perspective of everyone involved, involves loss. And, there's joy. And people for many decades love to focus on the joy. But when you're not paying attention to the loss and to the trauma that's involved, there's a tendency to miss the boat and to not see what's important to see. On the other hand, I think what I was concerned about was the pathologizing of adoptees. The bad seed, all the problems an adopted child might present with. And there was a lot of pathologizing. And what I did in my studies at Harvard at one point was to look at the developmental stages and to talk about what happened developmentally for any child. And we're usually given those stages and then shown what is pathological, what's really wrong. But for adopted children, there's an in-between state. Under the circumstances that they've gone through, they present differently. So if they have certain behaviors that someone might have called pathologizing, or called, that something was wrong with them in the past, if we really understand what this child has been through, we can understand that this is normal under the circumstances of adoption, that this child is making sense of some complex issues. We want parents to tell children they're adopted very early on. And so that's going to bring up a lot of questions in their mind.
Mm-hmm.
In the old days, people said you shouldn't tell children because they're not really prepared developmentally to take that complex information in. But they need to grow up knowing their truths. And that means it's going to be complex, and they're going to have some feelings about that, some big feelings. And those kinds of big feelings can be identified as pathology if we don't realize they're normal while a child is making sense of something this complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm thinking of the quote unquote normative crisis for a birth mom. It doesn't just go away. It stays with them for life. And I was just talking to a friend of mine who's a birth mom, and she said, I don't regret my decision. And I have a beautiful relationship, but how did she put it? I don't think it was regret, but basically she said, but I missed the opportunity to have been their parents, their mom. And that's what I still grieve. And that's, I think, what you would call a normative crisis.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then for parents, right? I went through a lot of fertility before I adopted my child. And every time I think I'm completely over that, and I talk about it and I find myself getting choked up, it surprises me. But that trauma of that time never leaves us.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't.
And they're simple, but they're there.
Absolutely.
You're an adoptee yourself.
I am.
When did you first begin to understand your own adoption experience and maybe even understand some of these normative crises? And I'm curious how you labeled them at the time. And did that drive you into what you're doing today or what you've been doing for years?
Well, I think we always have to look at the context. I was born in 1946. And so that was 1,000 years ago in terms of how involved people were in the world of adoption. And it was pretty amazing that my family, my aunt told me I was adopted when I was 3. And she was a lovely aunt, and she told me in a kind way. But I didn't understand it. And the problem in those days was people believed you could tell a child something once and then you could tick it off and say, oh, so we've already talked about that. But you can't tell a child once to get their coat because we're leaving in 10 minutes. You have to tell them at least 5 times. So you certainly can't tell them something this huge only once and expect them to take it in. So from then on, I was always exploring. I was looking for more information. I would bring it up in different ways. At the dinner table, I would talk about, who I looked like and what was going on. And nobody would talk about it. There were levels of what they would and wouldn't talk about. And my parents were no different than anybody else in that moment in time. They did the best they could, but they weren't into having those kinds of conversations with the child. And I know that I wondered, and I came rushing home crying one day when someone in the neighborhood said, yeah, you're adopted. You have red hair and no one else in your family does. So the neighborhood knew. People knew my mother wasn't pregnant, and all of a sudden she came home with a baby. Other people know. And so there's a lot of talk. And so I always knew in different ways, and I always wondered who was I and where did I come from? And I couldn't really ask those questions. When I did, the subject was changed. And again, my parents were great. They just weren't evolved, and this wasn't something they were aware of at all. So to fast forward, I do think this greatly shaped what I ended up doing. At first, I was going to go to medical school, and I didn't really love math and science enough to put myself through all of that. So I got 2 masters and a double doctorate. And I studied child development. I studied human development. I studied counseling, consulting, psychology at Harvard. And I really focused on adoption. And when I was at Harvard, and I was talking to my advisor about what I was doing, he said to me, Joyce, there's no such thing as the psychology of adoption. And I said, I beg to differ. I've lived it. And it's something that really needs to be looked at, really needs to be studied. And so it became my thing. And I think I was one of the early people to look at adoption in relation to mental health. And, there were many wonderful people looking at the stories of adoption and one of my dear friends, Betty Jean Lifton, wrote so many wonderful books about adoption. She was a great writer. Much later in life, she studied psychology because she knew it was so much a part of what was going on. But I started clinics that would focus on adoption. And the clinics that I started were unusual and were the only ones at the time that didn't have anything to do with placement. I felt that placement agencies had the best people who really understood adoption because that was their work, but it was a conflict of interest. How are they going to really serve all of the people they were dealing with fairly if that was their business? And so I started clinics that didn't have anything to do with the business of adoption and that really were there to serve the people that lived in the world of adoption.
Wow. So you were one of the first, what we call today, adoption competent therapists.
Right.
And you started these groups for mostly for adoptees. Is that what it was?
A whole clinics. We had 23 therapists in my last clinic. And we had interns of all different ilk. We had psychologists, marriage and family therapists, expressive therapists. I mean, it was, really a place where people could, and there were groups that we led, but we provided a large number of services for people. And it wasn't just legal adoption. It was also what I call emotional adoption. So there were kinship placements, there were foster care, there were step-parent adoptions, there were, all kinds of people who had the same psychological and emotional issues, but weren't legally adopted necessarily.
What happened to those clinics today?
Well, the last one lived for a long time and it was very wonderful. But after 2008, we lost a lot of grants. This is going to happen again right now in this very moment. We're seeing the cutting of a lot of nonprofits and a lot of supports. And that, and I have to say some of my practices, which I carefully chose to do the way I did, were not the most cost effective. I like to train therapists by having them do co-therapy. So they could be with a senior clinician and sort of learn in that way. That is not cost effective because those two people could be bringing in different insurance money separately and double the amount of money the clinic was making. But I was more interested in making sure people were well trained.
Yeah. Well, thank you, by the way, for starting this, for opening that door that's still open today. And there's still not enough adoption competent therapists. We still struggle to find people who really truly it's one thing for a therapist to say, oh yeah, I've worked with adoptees. Yeah, but have you studied it? Do you know the nuances? Do you know the complexities? And there aren't a lot out there who do. Thankfully there's more and more. So thanks for paving the way.
There aren't enough trainings either, Rebecca.
Right.
At one point in time, Professor Gary Mallon from the Hunter Graduate School of Social Work and myself had big federal grants. And we did 5-year postgraduate courses at Hunter Graduate School of Social Work. So after a master's degree, you could go back and specialize in adoption. And those programs were the first that were that comprehensive, I think. There are a few other places in the country that have provided those kinds of courses as well. And now there are more that are done, but it's so necessary for people to have an understanding about trauma and an understanding about the intricacies of adoption.
Yeah, for sure. Another a term that a lot of adoptees use is ambiguous loss. Can you describe what that is first?
Okay, here's a funny analogy.
Okay.
If you have um, an illness, that if you have I don't know, lupus, or you have psoriatic arthritis, or you have some of these things that aren't that obvious, you're still functioning, but
Okay.
you're dealing with, and people don't see it. If you don't see that someone is
Even mental
ill,
health. Yeah.
it's very hard to give them the support they need, and not to
Right.
accuse them of being lazy or of being, neglectful. Or so I think ambiguous loss has a lot to do with that kind of viewpoint from the outside. And, I think when people lose a whole family in a car wreck, and everyone gathers around you and grieves with you and feels terrible that you had this terrible loss, you're given some of the supports you need to go through that grieving process. But when you lose a whole family in adoption, it's considered joyful that you found a new family.
Yeah.
And there's not enough attention paid to the fact that you also lost. And everyone, as you mentioned earlier, every single person in that constellation is dealing with various kinds of loss.
Yeah.
And it's not being acknowledged. And not to acknowledge it really makes people feel a little crazy, and makes everyone else see them as being ungrateful, or whatever the words you want to use are.
Yeah.
So I think ambiguous loss is it's complicated because it's hard to define.
Yeah. That's a great analogy. And even if it's even if we're doing everything quote unquote right inside the home, and we are discussing it and we are open about it, when you walk into the world, it's still there. It's still there. It doesn't go away because you're dealing with it in multiple places in your life, not just in your home environment. But speaking of that, how can adoptive parents support their children through ambiguous loss, even when it's invisible or unnamed in the outside world? Before we go on, we're going to take a quick break, but don't go away. We still have so much to talk about. Hey there, Adoption Roadmap fam. Are you ready to take the next step on your journey to parenthood? If so, head over to our website and take our quiz. It's called, Are You Ready to Adopt? It's not just about testing your knowledge. It's about making sure you're emotionally and practically prepared for the beautiful, complex journey of adoption. Let's make your dream of parenthood a reality. Go to rgadoptionconsulting.com and take the Are You Ready to Adopt quiz today. That's rgadoptionconsulting.com. The quiz is free, and it will let you know where you are in the process and if you're ready to jump into your adoption journey. How can adoptive parents support their children through ambiguous loss, even when it's invisible or unnamed in the outside world?
It's so hard, and there's no one answer that I can give you for that, because everyone's different in their way of being, and every child is different in their way of taking things in. And you can't focus on this all the time, or you're not. I mean, kids are kids. They're also just being children. It's very important not to ignore any of the issues that are there as a matter of adoption. But it's also not very good to make them the forefront and talk about them all the time. I think it's a very complicated situation for adoptive parents. I think if adoptive parents are well educated themselves and aware of all of this, they're the experts on their child. So they'll know how to, and if you had 4 children, you'd have 4 different approaches. So I don't think anyone can tell you what to do, but other than just keep yourself really well informed, well aware, check yourself when you feel strident about something, or when just be open to what's going on and to how a child is responding to certain things or acting out around certain things. um, this week I've had occasion in my practice to talk to 2 adult adoptees who, and this is important, and I've been working lately with a lot of adoptive parents of adult adoptees and a lot of adult adoptees. Um, there is the world at large affects adoption all the time. I'm working with a 21-year-old Guatemalan adoptee who is afraid to walk to work. She doesn't have a car. She usually takes public transportation. We're in greater Boston and we have pretty good public transportation. But because of ICE and because she looks very Guatemalan and she's Central American, she is scared to death. And she's a naturalized citizen of the United States. She was adopted as a under 1-year-old, and she's a college graduate. I mean, she's a great person, a great American. And yet she's afraid that she will be seen as something else and something will happen to her. Her fear, her anxiety is huge lately. And then I also have a Chinese adoptee, and he is scared to death of the world situation and the way China is being viewed and the way he's being viewed and the conversations he's been forced to have with people at work and in other places that he's not at all prepared to have. He's never lived in China since his birth. So I think we don't understand how much intensity goes on for people who are adopted in different situations. Even the news affects them.
Yeah, so true. And, I think as parents, the best that we can do is to continue to have the conversations inside our homes, even when it's not being brought up by our children, especially when it's not being brought up by them. We cannot assume that if it's not being brought up by them, then they're fine. That's probably not the case because they probably aren't going to be the ones that are bringing it up. We have to, not every day, but we have to bring it up every once in a while. I had I'll never forget an adoptee panel that I was listening to, and one of the people on that panel said, it was never talked about in our family, so I felt like I couldn't talk about it because it was never talked about. Now, the family probably thought, well, we were just waiting for that. Of course we were open to it. But our kids don't know that unless if it's a regular part of conversation. And again, not every day. But I think that's one thing that we can be doing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It really isn't the job of the child to bring up issues. One of the things that I used to teach adoptive parents is indirect communication. Kids don't like you out of the blue to bring up things. For the most part, it annoys them. But you can do it.
I have a teenager right now, so I can attest.
What I'm talking about. So, but you can watch something together. You can watch a movie. You can watch a Netflix series. You can watch anything on TV, or you can watch a talk show. And if the subject comes up, you can talk about the subject. You can be shoulder to shoulder with your child or your adolescent, and you can talk about what's going on and say, what do you think they think about that? What do you think's going on there? And kids are very happy to have a conversation about something out there. You know, it's a bit of a Rorschach, and you're getting a lot of information about how they feel. But they're just telling you what's going on the screen and how they're seeing it. So
Right.
those kinds of indirect conversations are very helpful. The other thing I used to instruct parents to do is, if it's a two-parent family, to have a discussion within earshot of the child that you would like to have with the child, but they don't seem open to it. So because kids have elephant ears, you know, they're listening. They're in the next room, but they're absolutely listening if you're talking. And so, you know, have a conversation at the level that you want them to hear it with
Mm-hmm.
each other. And they will then hear it. And you can at some point turn around and say, Josh, come talk to us and tell us your version of, you know, do you have an opinion about what we're talking about? And, you know, if they want to join, they will. And if they don't, they won't. But they will have heard what you're saying. So indirect communication, of course, isn't always the best. But I think it's really good with kids if you're
Yeah.
trying to have conversations about things that they are avoiding or that, you know, they're not really into.
Yeah. You had alluded to this earlier that, and I think it was with ambiguous loss, I can't remember, but that, you know, there's many times families think that, well, I adopted at birth, so they don't really have the type of trauma that somebody adopted older would. Um, how do you think early separation, like at birth, and relinquishment imprint on a child's nervous system, even if there's no conscious memory of it? I'm having a hard time this morning speaking, but you know what I'm saying.
I do. I think it has a huge impact. And I think in the past, we did sort of think, oh, you know, he was a baby, she was a baby,
Yeah.
I don't remember anything. But let's remember that this baby spent 9 months in utero. And what happened in utero? You know, it's really important to think about the impact, because this is when things are forming and growing. And, you know, was the birth mother 15, and did she eat poorly? And, you know, was she staying up all night scrolling and watching things and not getting enough sleep? I mean, there's so many different potential issues. And was this child adopted from an orphanage where they weren't really fed, or in a way when the child needed to be fed, they were fed, you know, at a certain time?
Yeah.
um, these are all really important things, and they have a huge impact on children. And the loss, the disconnection. What we know about childbirth is that really the second part of childbirth is the time after the child is born, for about 6 to 9 months, when they're breastfeeding and when they're attaching to people in their life. And that changes. Everything changes. Maybe two times. Maybe they go to a foster home before they go to their forever family. It's important for us to pay attention to the fact that, and there's no conscious memory, but there is, you know, Bessel van der Kolk, a famous trauma specialist, talks about how the body keeps the score.
Yeah.
So whatever you felt when there's a trigger of a feeling and you don't even know what it's from, it is there. And I
Yeah.
think it makes it pretty complex. And there's no sort of competition about whose situation is worse. An 8-year-old who knows their birth mother and who is adopted at that point and has a full memory of their birth family and calls their grandmother once a week,
Mm-hmm.
you know, there are some things about that that are easier, and some things about
Mm-hmm.
that are much harder.
Mm-hmm.
There's no competition. This is all very complicated. And it
Yeah.
should never be taken for granted that there isn't a huge loss and trauma associated with adoption, and that it hasn't impacted this child in various ways, which doesn't mean they can't be fine in the long run.
Yeah. I remember even when I adopted my son, who's now almost 14, I was of the belief that, well, he was adopted at birth. I was the only conscious, I was the only mother he had that he knows, and blah, blah, blah. Until I read The Primal Wound, and then it started to make sense. And I started hearing all these people talking about, no, that's not the case. And it does affect, that it is still trauma even at birth. And I thought, okay, if all these people are saying it, and let me read this book. And then it hit me. And I was like, okay, yeah, this makes sense. And then The Body Keeps the Score came out. I'm curious if you know when that thought or when that study really came to the conversation, really came to the forefront. When did people start changing their mind that, yeah, maybe even at birth they
Well,
have trauma?
we always talked about it at my clinics, but it didn't mean the world was taking it on.
Yeah.
One by one with families, though, they would begin to understand. I mean, people come to learn how to be better, how to be better parents, how to,
We hope so.
make their child well, so they take in whatever is there and process it for themselves.
Yeah.
And if you break it down, it makes sense. It makes
Yeah.
every bit of sense. And I think it doesn't take away from you being, I mean, the birth mother will always be the birth mother of that child, and you
Right.
will always be the parent of that child. And there's no competition or taking away from each other.
Right.
That's the reality. And it's really important to understand that and to understand what an impact that has on the child. And the more you can accept it, the more the child can accept the divided loyalty that they
Yeah.
have.
Are there certain things as adoptive parents that we should be looking for or recognize in the behavior of our children as they're growing up that might tell us they're experiencing some of this trauma that might be related to adoption? And I'm asking this specifically because there's so many families that say, is this an adoption thing, or is this just a behavioral, every child goes through this thing? Is there anything we can be looking for or be able to tell the difference?
Well, I'll send you a copy of something that I did for the Department of Mental Health in the state of Massachusetts years ago.
Great.
And it's a little breakdown of my developmental stages. And it shows what some of the responses are for kids at different stages and what the strategies are to deal with it. And I think it's pretty helpful. And
Oh, I would love that.
there are things that, and when you ask the question, is this adoption or is it developmental? It's both.
Yeah.
If adoption is the foundation of your being, then it's woven in. It's like a tapestry, and it's part of the whole. And so I think it's really important to realize that and to know that, and not everybody is the same. Like I said, you could have 4 kids who have different responses. They have different personalities. They have different dispositions. They have different stories of what their, time in utero was like, what their birth was like, what their experiences after were like, how many changes and moves they had. It will be different for each of them. But I think there's a way to look at things and to realize, for little kids especially, transitions are very hard. And not that that isn't true for some other kids, but I think transitions hold a lot more for kids who are adopted. So, often parents will come and say, it's Sunday night and Monday morning are horrible in our house.
Yes.
And that is, if you understand why, you can figure out how to cope with it and how to do whatever you need to do to make it work out better. But it's normal under the circumstances. Changes are hard. There have been too many abrupt changes in this baby's early life that have affected this now 9-year-old. and also anger. Anger is a cover for sadness. And if you can't really understand where your sadness is coming from or what's going on, anger it's actually a very useful cover. I think anger is really good. It's not good if you're a parent in the middle of the aisle at the grocery store, but it is actually a very good emotion. It shows you that something is wrong, something isn't being dealt with, and it is a cover. It doesn't stand alone. So I think learning some things about that and understanding what's going on when there's a meltdown or when there's a flip out is really important. There are many other little pieces like that, and lying. Adoptees, little adoptees have a tendency to lie more than non-adoptees, partially because they have been told so many lies. They can't get the truth out of anyone. And it isn't that their parents aren't telling them the truth. Their parents don't know the truth any more than they do. There's information about their life that isn't being shared.
Wow. You just hit on three things that I haven't heard talk about. And yet I'm like, yep. I saw that. It's fascinating. I could talk about this all day. I think it's just so interesting to me. And you're right. When we know these things, we can react differently.
Absolutely.
Especially if any parent out there is like me, who's very reactive. Maybe if I understood a little bit better, I would have been able to take a step back.
And the more you regulate yourself, the more the child gets regulated, which is not that easy. It's not that easy. It's nice to say that. It sounds good, but it's not that easy. And yet it's really important to figure out how. And, I think people in general and parents and adoptive parents in a moment feel like this child is doing something to them.
Yeah.
And for the most part, these kids have no idea what they're doing. They're really just reacting to some stimuli, and they really don't know why. And they burst into tears at the end of it, and say, I don't know why I did that. I don't know why I said that. And they really don't know. They're not doing it to drive you nuts.
Yeah. Remember that, parents, next time your kid is starting to drive you nuts, just remember, they're not trying to drive me nuts.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. You have worked with now thousands of adoptive families. So what, in your experience, do parents most often misunderstand or underestimate about the child's internal experience? And I think we're hitting on a lot of those right now, but is there anything that you see as a common theme that we just continue to misunderstand or underestimate about our kids?
So many subtle things, but the couple of things to just throw out there.
Yeah.
I'm always interested in parents who say, oh, I don't have any of those problems with my child. They're just fine.
They're lying.
No, I think the child is suppressing some things and protecting their parents. And some of them aren't. Some of them just aren't there yet. People develop in different ways and at different stages and with different pacing. Yeah. And there are some adoptees that don't really pay attention to all of these issues until they're 20, 30, 40 years old. And so they're busy just being a kid or being an adolescent, but they're still having a lot of issues and problems that if we could identify what's going on and give them more reality base about what's going on, it might prevent some of the drug use, some of the acting out, some of the running away, running toward. I mean, there are lots of different ways that, there are kids who just don't get a chance to make sense of what's going on for them. And so they make sense of it in ways that are destructive. And that is not helpful and it's not good. So I think one thing is not to pretend everything's fine. You might, I mean, you have a great kid,
Yeah.
but that doesn't mean they're not trying to make sense of the complexity of their life.
Mm-hmm.
It's, it's really important. And this takes me back to what you said before. It's important to bring up these subjects. And even if you do it indirectly, to say, oh, wow, I just read this really interesting book and I wouldn't, let me read this to you. What do you think? I mean, I always put the adoptee in the role of being the consultant to the parents.
Mm.
So I pull them over next to me in a therapy room and say, okay, you're going to be my consultant. Your parents are trying to figure out how to be the best parents they can for you. And
That's
I can tell
brilliant.
them some general things because I've been around a long time, but I want you to help us. And, they'll sit there and laugh or not talk or whatever. And then after a while, I'll turn and say, well, what would you like them to do in this situation? And they'll begin to open up. And I think it's really important for kids to share. They're afraid. They love you. And they're afraid if they say anything, you'll perceive it as them being disloyal.
Yes.
And they don't, as much as they drive you nuts, they don't want to hurt you. And so they hurt you more by not hurting you and saying, I'll tell you a horrible story about me. When I was 12 years old, roughly, I came down to breakfast on Mother's Day and I said, Sarah, what are we having for breakfast? And I called my mother by her first name because I was really conscious that she wasn't my real mother on that particular day. And my father overheard this, and I'm exaggerating, but he pinned me against the wall. He was not a violent person. And he said, do not speak to your mother like that ever again. And the funny thing was, my mother sort of liked it. From then on, I every once in a while called her Sarah, and she sort of enjoyed it. But the point was, I was being passive aggressive. I was trying to make a point. And I don't even know if she got it, but she got it. And it would have been great to have a conversation about that. It would have been great to say, I wonder what my birth mother's doing today. I wonder if she thinks of me. I wonder if she, had any other kids. I wonder. A conversation like that with anyone, because there was no one in the 1950s having that conversation. But I think kids need an outlet and they need to be able to talk about some of these things, and they're afraid to.
Yeah. Do you see that? It struck a chord when you said our kids want to protect us a lot of times.
Mm-hmm.
Is pleasing a common theme in adoption?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The fear of rejection is a huge fear for adoptees. I mean, you were already, maybe you weren't rejected, but the perception is that you were rejected. You weren't kept by the first family that had you. So, that fear of rejection is huge. And there's a fear that if you don't behave a certain way, something will happen. I just had a 38-year-old in my office a couple of weeks ago, and I've been seeing him and his family since he was 5. And I see him about this time. It's probably been 15 years since I saw him last.
Wow.
And he, there was a situation where the family took another child after him, and it wasn't a good fit. And I don't know what the circumstances were at this point, but the child was not kept in that family. And we talked about it, and we talked about it again last week. He felt like that to him at age 5 was a message that adoption isn't forever. Because this other child didn't get to stay in his family. So maybe he wouldn't if he wasn't good. So he became the best child he could be. He excelled at everything. He was the best in his class. He was the best kid. And, right now at 38, he's trying to figure out how he can just be himself. He's not the best. He's good enough. He's better than good enough, but he's not the best. And that's okay.
Yeah. I think this was one of your quotes. You said, "It is during the pre-adoptive stage that parents to be are most vulnerable and inexperienced, and the agencies and adoption professionals too often work against the child's welfare, and so against the adoptive family's interests as well.
Mm-hmm.
They work against child's welfare and in turn against the adoptive family's interests as well." What do you mean by this?
So much. I don't think we do a great job, even today. I mean, it's been many, many years since I've worked with agencies so closely, and I feel like there are some agencies that do a really the best job they can do, and there are some that don't. And it's like a restaurant. If you get a new chef, it could be not the restaurant you loved. And these agencies go through changes. Their social workers leave and, run off and become a flamenco dancer, or they get married and move to Ohio, or they do, whatever. And then they have new people they're training. They can't do the quality control and the training that they need to do to provide the best possible services. And their business depends on doing adoptions, whether it's public or private. And so it sets it up so that it's not really giving people the best help. That's why I started the clinics that I did. I think pre-adoptive parents need to be challenged. They need to know, if you're writing a piece for your adoption agency about how wonderful you'll be as parents, and you want to be the best that you can be. You don't want to show any problems. I would have, and things have changed over the years. People now say, I'm a recovered alcoholic, or I had this problem as a adolescent. Those things people hid and still do to some extent.
I think very much.
Yeah. But I think those are really important things to explore, because adoption is complicated.
Yeah.
And we don't want people that have had perfect lives and have never had to deal with anything difficult. This is going to be a mess for them if they run into some complicated issues along the way. It's much better that they've had some issues and have overcome them. So how do you get people to really admit what's gone on for them, what worked and what didn't work? Who did they depend on? What is their community? How do they get the support that they need? What kind of child are they thinking of getting? I always think of this one couple that I saw who were adorable, really lovely people. And the dad was a jokester. And at this point in time, it was probably the 1980s, and the biggest international adoptions were, I don't know, Romania was one of the places that adoptions were happening. And so he said, wow, we have to really watch those little gypsy kids. They'll steal the silver. And he started laughing, and she chuckled. And I said, wait a minute. How is that okay that you said that? And he said, oh, Joyce, I'm just kidding. You know me. I said, it's not okay. When that child is in your family, and when you're angry about something they've done, or you have some comment to make, that's racist, and that's not okay. That's just not okay. And I think you guys will be great parents, but I would never allow, if I were the agency, I would never allow you to adopt a kid from Romania, because you would have to do an awful lot of work. You would have to read everything about the Romanian people and all of the amazing things from their past history, other than that they were gypsies. It's just not going to work for your family if that's your only take on this child. And they ended up adopting not a child from Romania. And I don't know whatever happened to them. Some people I see again, some people I don't.
Yeah.
But I do think people need to be, and no one in an agency is going to ask them those questions. They're going to put them in line. The fastest adoption at that point was Romanian kids would be adopted within 6 months. You would have a much longer wait for an American child, a newborn. So they were going to be in the shortest line and get the child that was next in line for them. And that's not necessarily what's best for your family. And it's
Or
certainly
going
not
back,
for
what's
the child.
best for the child, right? Right.
Right. So
Now, when you say like that we need to be more upfront about some of these things that we've overcome, who are you talking about being open to? The agency, the birth mom, the expectant mom, or both? Before we go on, I'm going to take a quick break, but don't go anywhere. We have so much more to cover. Listen up, Roadmap fans. Do you have a transracial family? Maybe you've struggled to find the right products for your child's hair and skin. You're not alone. But listen, I found your solution. If you're anything like me and care about clean, natural products without harsh chemicals, you've got to check out Sweet Peach Tree. It was founded by a white mom with a black daughter who gets it. They've created safe, effective products made for melanin-rich skin and textured hair, but it's not just for them, it's for the entire family. Head to sweetpeachtree.com and use code ROADMAP10 for 10% off your first order. Sweetpeachtree.com. Use the code ROADMAP10 for 10% off your first order. Sweet Peach Tree, made with your family in mind. When you say like that we need to be more upfront about some of these things that we've overcome, who are you talking about being open to? The agency, the birth mom, the expectant mom, or both?
everybody. First of all, I'm old, so I can say things, and and you can just fire me if you don't like it. I think that what needs to change is the whole system of adoption. There's been too much trafficking, pseudo trafficking. There are serious problems that aren't the fault of any of the people, any of the birth first families, any of the pre-adopting families, or any of the children. But what goes on to make it happen, the business of adoption, the industry of adoption, even with lovely people, and we have some amazing people working in that field of child welfare, but the system is terrible, and it really needs to be completely renovated, if you want my opinion. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done there. And the birth parents, we talked about how little direct and good services and challenges the pre-adoptive parents get. The birth parents get even less. It's not good at all. And the agency's point is to do adoptions. So they're not really trying to make sure the birth parent is making a completely conscious decision for the long term. So many birth parents are angry at their parents, so they don't even tell them they're pregnant. And, I would spend a lot of time with potential birth parents, getting them to invite their family in.
Yes.
And getting them to get, whether there was going to be an adoption or not, they would need support, and they would need the truth to be out. And it would be really important to have their family. The agency would never do that. The danger of having the birth mother change her mind and keep that child was not what they needed.
Now, I am hoping that it has gotten better. I know that there are some organizations out there that support birth moms. There are a lot of agencies that have now developed birth mom post placement programs, which is great. Where I see some of the issues, and I'm always pushing back on agencies. I mean, one of the things I'm most proud of when I ask the agencies, do do other consultants ask you as many questions as I do and they say no? I'm like, awesome. I love that. I'm so proud of that. But I'll ask things like, have they received options counseling? And does that include you having a conversation about abortion?
Mm-hmm.
Does she have any family support? If not, when is that? Or she plans to tell her parents, well, when? And I think that one of the biggest issues right now is the rush that the agencies feel to make a match, even if mom is pushing for it, so that she doesn't go somewhere else.
Right.
It's not that they're doing bad work. It's not that they're checking off the boxes, because some of them might be, but to what extent are they checking those boxes? Why are they rushing through it? It takes time to build a relationship. There are so many places that talk to a birth mom once or an expectant mom once, and the next day are matching them. Now, I'm not here to judge. I am not on that side of the business, nor do I want to be. I can only understand from whatever knowledge I have and question it. And I do question it. And I think we all need to question it. And I think that adoptive parents are afraid sometimes to question. And now we're getting into the whole power issue. But I think people just need to slow down and do what they know is right.
You're right. It's more about the business. They're trying to close the deal.
Yeah.
I hate to use transactional business
Yeah.
language, but really that's what gets in the way. And,
Mhm.
in the early days of adoption wasn't like this till the 1930s, 40s.
Mhm.
It became a big business, sort of with my cohort. We were the post-war babies, and there were tons of us. So you could make all kinds of arrangements, and it happened. And so the business sort of began to bloom at
Mhm.
that point. Before that, and in the UK for a long time, a birth mother was not allowed to sign a release of her baby for at least 6 months, because it was in the UK in the early 80s. You were not allowed to be tried for murder if you had had a baby within the last 6 months, because your
Mm.
hormones, you were not back to normal,
Mm.
and your hormones affected this is all whatever, however you feel about that. But the point is, it takes a longer time. And if you trust
Mhm.
that someone is going to make a decision, and many of those birth mothers that kept their babies for 6 months knew that they weren't prepared to be a parent at that point and
Mhm.
needed to do something else. They knew it. It wasn't just something that happened and then they could feel, wait a minute, did I do the right thing? It actually worked out better for everyone in that situation. And I don't think we do the right thing at all with birth
Yeah.
mothers. We don't give them a chance to really see what's going on. We had a funny program, Rebecca, at one time. We did this program with a nonprofit in the Boston area, where young pregnant teens
Mhm.
would be placed with their baby in foster care, and they would be totally responsible for taking care of the baby, for getting to school, for making arrangements, for doing everything. The foster mother was just there as oversight so that
Mm.
nothing would happen. The foster mother was the foster mother for the teen, not for the baby, but they were there. And they could teach the teen ways to parent. They could
Sure.
make suggestions, but they weren't allowed to take over.
Wow.
The point was
I love that.
for the parent to learn whether or not, that I'm keeping my baby thing is so abstract. What about, this is your baby, and the baby cries, you know all night, and you can't get any sleep, and you have to get up and go to school the next day. I mean, there are so many things that are the realities. And these are concrete thinkers. These kids are not, these were not old enough to have reflective thinking about all of this. So I don't know. I don't think we're creative enough in how we do this and trusting enough that the right children will be in the right situation.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And another piece of this is the therapeutic piece, right? So I truly believe that everybody in the triad, I mean, obviously adoptees come later, but for birth moms and for hopeful parents, I think it should be mandatory to go through some sort of therapy and counseling. Um, we we recommend that to every single family, and I can probably name you on one hand in the past 13 years how many people actually take that advice from the get-go. And I tell people it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when you are going to want somebody in your back pocket. So start now, because even if you don't know what to ask help for, just go in and say, we are hoping to adopt. And if they're adoption competent, they'll know where to guide that direction, that conversation. But at the same time, on the same panel with adoptees, one of the adoptees said, the person that's been most important in my life consistently over the last, I don't know, I think she was 18, has been my therapist. And I really took that to heart as an adoptive parent, thinking, and a lot of other heads nodded, thinking, okay, adoptees need somebody outside of me, a therapist, who really knows adoption. But there's a lot of resistance even now around therapy. I know that that's gotten a lot better, but is there a way that as parents we can hold space and stay connected even when our child is emotionally closed off and isn't willing to do that? Like, are there some tricks that we can?
It's so interesting because I'm totally against the pathologizing of adoptees.
Okay, right.
So,
Yes.
So it's a little bit of talking out of both sides of your mouth. To say someone should be in therapy and then to say there's nothing, there's nothing.
Okay.
And I do completely agree. As a matter of fact, I don't know whether one would think this was legal, but I would require that all of the therapists and interns that worked in my clinic were in therapy.
I remember that was I'm an MSW, and I remember when that was a thing.
Yeah. You can't do therapy unless you've been in therapy. You need to be on both sides so that you can have a better view of what's going on and what the impact is and who's a good therapist and who isn't.
Yeah.
And that's an important thing. I do a whole training on, how to choose an adoption competent therapist and how to be an adoption competent therapist.
Oh, wow.
And I think that there are many people these days, just like you said, I mean, who say, oh, I've worked with adoptees, so I'm adoption competent. It's like when family systems therapy, which I love, it became popular in the 1980s. People would say, oh, I see families. I'm a family therapist. It isn't about the families that you see or the adoptees that you see. It's about the underpinnings. It's about what do you understand about this whole structure, and what do you understand about what's going on and what people need and how they're impacted by each other. And, I mean, there's so much more to it. And so it's hard to know which therapist will be best to work with one. And a lot of kids don't want to be in therapy. They're, they don't want to take up the time. They'd rather be, on their screens or playing soccer or doing whatever they want to do. It's interesting though, if you can engage kids, they then see the value and get into it. I used to say it takes 6 months. People would, I don't know, you're supposed to be able to give people a diagnosis in 2 sessions so you can collect insurance. And that's ridiculous. You don't know anyone that quickly. I think it takes a long time to develop trust.
Oh, yeah.
So
for sure.
I expect, a lot of times I'm just hanging out with kids for the first few sessions. I'm asking them questions about nothing to do with adoption. I'm learning who they are. I'm talking about
Yeah.
all kinds of things. And, if they don't like working with me, we need to find them someone they do.
Yeah.
At this point of my career, I do a lot of assessments of kids and
Yeah.
their parents. I don't see that many children. I see some older adolescents and adult adoptees, but I mostly see children with their parents because they'd rather be on the floor playing with a young therapist. And I think that's the best thing for them, to have someone that you can play with. Play is the work of children. And you want someone that's going to get down and play and sand tray or play therapy or all kinds of different modalities, but that's really going to be there with you, paying attention to you, and giving you undivided attention for that therapy hour. That kids get to like that because
I love that you brought that out because my son's therapist, all they do for the entire hour is play Yahtzee or Jenga or whatever. I'm like, did you talk? He's like, yeah, we talked, but we were also playing, and that's how they connect.
that's it.
So,
That's it.
yeah. And I always say you need to hear different theories. You need to hear the same theory multiple times before you actually believe it. So I love that you brought that up because it's
No, I
exactly
think it's
right.
really true. And, I think it is very valuable. It's an intimate relationship therapy. So
Yeah.
if you make a connection and you find someone, I'll come into a situation, a family will say, oh, Joni has had this therapist for 4 years and she really likes her, but she doesn't know anything about adoption and we want to change therapists. Could you see her? And what I always say is, if she has a therapist that she likes for four
Mm.
years, this is a kid who's adopted. You're not going to take that person away. What you need to do is have me do a consult with that therapist and,
Great distinction.
and really help them to see things in a certain way. Maybe they need to hire me for some supervision once every 6 weeks. Maybe they need to do this or that, or not just me, but give them a list of names
Yeah.
of people. But, don't get rid of people in adoptees' lives when they're working.
That is brilliant. I love that you said that, and that could probably go for anyone, families alike, because there are a lot of people who already have a relationship with a therapist. So maybe it's not about switching; it's about getting the therapist the
Yeah.
knowledge that they need. I love that. You make an important distinction between healing and fixing. Can you unpack that for us? And what does true healing even look like?
I don't think you fix human beings don't get fixed.
Yeah,
Furniture gets fixed, computers
furniture.
get
Yeah,
fixed. It's, and fixing means there's something broken.
yeah,
Um, Healing, there is definitely trauma and loss in
yeah.
adoption. And no matter whether you think everything's fine or not, there has been a rupture and there needs to be repair. And so the more you learn rupture and repair, the more you know how to heal yourself. And I think
Mm.
that people need skills and strategies for dealing with trauma and for dealing with loss and for dealing with difficult situations. And that isn't fixing them. They're fine. They're good people. They just have this thing that gets in the way of them functioning in the best possible way for themselves.
So, what are some of those skills that for the parents listening today that we might be able to start using right now, or some practices to help create a more open and emotionally safe and connected relationship?
I think the parent's job is to be the therapist.
Okay.
So I think it's important to be just a loving, accepting, listening. You need to learn how to regulate your own feelings so that
Mm-hmm.
there's work that each of us have to do ourselves for the other. So parents have their work to do. But I think that for kids to learn what skills they need. If their parents tell them they need it, it sounds like they need fixing.
Mm.
If their therapist tells them, hey, here's a trick that a lot of kids use. Well, since the pandemic, I don't think there's a single person in the world who isn't anxious and doesn't have anxiety. I love that song, Anxiety. Whoever wrote that and is making $1 million because that's what everyone is experiencing. So I think the important thing is to figure out how to deal with it and to give people some little strategies. And one of the things when you're feeling really anxious is to distract yourself from the anxiety by, this is something lots of therapists and people use, think of one thing that you love to look at, a beautiful flower. One thing that you love to listen to, beautiful music or birds singing. One thing, take each of your senses and walk through them and tell yourself something about each of those senses. I mean, that's just one of many different things you can do. It's really about disarming yourself and distracting yourself from this focus on something that's going to drive you crazy. And I think that everyone is anxious and everyone is having trouble. I don't mean everyone because everyone's not the same, but so many people are having trouble reacclimating themselves to situations like school. I mean, kids in classrooms are much different than they were before the pandemic. They act out in different ways. They missed all of the sports they needed. That is the best antidepressant in the history of the world, is sports.
Amen.
So if you lost, 2.5 years of sports, that's a real setback. I mean, there are all these things that we have to figure out how to deal with and what to do about. And meanwhile, the world is in chaos and that's going on around us.
Yeah, it certainly is. And speaking of all of that, and one of the biggest problems with everything you just mentioned is community or lack thereof, right? So I know you've talked about healing, it doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in community.
Mm-hmm.
Is it enough for adoptive parents to connect with other adoptive parents, or is it also essential for adoptees to be in community with other adoptees?
I think it really helps for adoptees to be in community with other adoptees. It's hard when they're little and it's fun. And the stories are so different that it gets complicated. For adult adoptees, it's, the internet and, there's so much joining and connecting that's going on. And that clearly people would tell you this is really helping. But for kids, it's harder. I remember doing a training to fix, the word fix, a mess that was made in a very lovely private school in New York. And it was a very expensive private school. They had a lot of adopted kids and families. And they decided that they were going to talk about adoption in the classroom. And so one of the teachers got up and said, there are different ways that families are made and and, Rebecca is adopted and Joyce is adopted and Harry is adopted and Sam is adopted. Now, Sam was never told he was adopted and his parents just donated the library to the school. So this isn't, I'm exaggerating, but this isn't going to go over well at all. Some people are very open about this and some aren't. And it really wasn't the place of this teacher, who wasn't adoption competent, to bring up these issues in the classroom. She did it with the best of intentions. She wanted to start an after-school club like the ones they had for kids in a divorce, whatever. But it just wasn't a good idea. And so I had to come in and train all of the teachers and guidance counselors and do a whole other thing with them about this. It just is difficult. And so I think community for littler kids and even some teens is is sports or drama or, getting them involved with people with like interests. Getting them away from screens. That's the other thing the pandemic did. I mean, we were stuck.
You're
We were
talking to.
sequestered away.
Yeah.
And, so what are we going to do to get kids, fine. I mean, that's great that I just read an interesting study that some of the best surgical medical students were medical students who had been on screens and were really adept, because now we use all these robotic procedures.
Yeah.
So that's great. We have nice surgeons. But we don't want all kids hanging out on their screens all day. So it's really important to get them involved in whatever community or group they can be involved in. I mean, be in a robotics club, be on a soccer team.
Is there a certain time, though, that as parents, we should make an effort to have them be with other adopted children, or at least make an effort to know who in our community is a family like ours and maybe try to get together as families? Or is that important to the children, either as they're growing up, even for us to be able to do, or to try to nudge them along as they get older?
If it's organic,
Yeah.
it's good. But if it's contrived, it's not. I have to tell you, I never mentioned adoption with my sister at all. If I brought up anything about adoption, everyone changed the subject. And she was also adopted, and we never discussed it until years after I searched, when she said, will you help me search?
Wow.
So there, and I also had two friends in the neighborhood who were adopted. It helped for me to know they were adopted, but we never talked about it. Never. Now that's back in the day when no one ever talked about anything. So I'm not comparing that with today. But I think it really needs to be real. If your best friend also adopted a child and you all hang out together and go, do activities together, great.
Yeah.
But if you're finding someone to do that and you don't really gel with that family, but you want to, their kid was adopted from the same country or something, and you want the kids to play, they're going to know that's put together in a weird way. I'd avoid that.
Yeah, for sure. Don't be weird. It's like transracial families. If you don't have any Hispanic friends,
Exactly.
don't just like
Come up
go and pick them up. Yeah. Although at the same time, like, we have a huge family and we get together for big family events. And I have definitely pointed out to my son who in our family has that commonality with him,
which is great.
that was also adopted, so he can be able to look around our family and say, oh, I'm not the only one in our family.
No, I think that's great to make some, and kids are surprised sometimes. In my office, parents will say, oh, you didn't know that so-and-so was adopted, and the child didn't. It's good to know that other people are.
Yeah.
I think that's really, really important. It's also good if you have some kind of a program that, that pulls adoptees together, that is adoption competent. We used to do art therapy groups for adopted kids at my clinic. And so they would be 6-week groups, and you could sign up for as many as you wanted. So when you were done with 6 weeks, you could do the next. And it was, all expressive arts therapists that were on our staff, and the kids made friends with each other and they had a great time. And, that was, it was what it was. So it worked. So I think there are things like that would be good. But it's hard with littler kids, I think.
Yeah. I think the moral of that story is don't be weird, but community is important.
Yes, indeed.
You have given us so many golden nuggets, Dr. Pavao. Thank you so much. I want to just say one of your quotes that I found to just really hit me. And that is, you cannot change the truth. These are your children, but they came from somewhere else. Your children do not belong to you, but they belong with you. I love that. Thank you for everything you have done to pave the way in adoption. Thank you for lending your voice. Thank you for saying yes when I asked you to be a guest on our podcast. But I'm not letting you go so quickly. I do have a couple rapid fire questions for you. The first is a shout out to one person or organization that has influenced your adoption journey or the work you're doing in adoption.
Well, it's heavy on my mind. Betty Jean Lifton, who's a fellow adoptee who passed away about 12 years ago, was her birthday the other day, and I posted something on Facebook about her. And she wrote. She was a really beautiful writer, and so if you haven't read any of her books, I totally recommend them. And a little side funny story. One of her favorite books that she wrote wasn't about adoption. It was called The King of Children. And it was about a Polish pediatrician who saved many of the children in the war. And she loved this guy and his story. So she wrote a book about it. And I had a call last week from a producer who's going to do a movie about it, and he wanted the rights. So I put him
wow.
Their family. And I think she'd be so happy. And because she really loved children, she was a children's book writer before she put her energy into adoption. So I would say she's been on my mind. So I shout out to BJ up there in the heavens.
Oh, that's beautiful. What's one piece of advice you would like to share with adoptive parents or hopeful adoptive parents?
Be real. Realize that you want a family, and that's why you're doing this. But in the process of that, you're losing the opportunity to have this child be part of your ancestry, and they're losing the part of them that's connected to another family. And if you can keep that in mind and cherish it and realize that, this is, you've been brought together for whatever reason, you're together, but you can't forget what's lost and what you're missing in the process. And if you, and that's true for the birth parent also, that I think, all of the parties involved have had a loss, and really it's important to embrace that and consider it a part of what's beautiful about all of you, and how you're going to be able to work together.
What's one thing you wish every adoptive parent knew before they brought their child home?
Well, I think a version of what you read, my quote, that these are not just your children. You want to embrace and claim this child, but they're also someone else's child. And if you don't allow that to be their truth, because it is, it will hurt the relationship in the long run. So just embrace the whole child, which everything that comes with them. Just as in a marriage, you get in-laws, whether you like them or not. And in an adoption, you get in-laws, you get a birth family, and you either have no idea who they are because it's a closed adoption, or you have an idea who they are and you're either close to them or not close to them, but they're part of that child, so you embrace them.
Describe adoption in 3 words.
Oh God, I need an overnight. I need time to think of 3 words that will give justice to that question. So I don't feel ready to answer. I plead the 5th.
I love it. Dr. Pavao, how can people get in touch with you or follow your work?
Well, my website is www.pavoconsulting, Pavao consulting.com. And it has a lot of information, and also how to get in touch with me, contact information. And my email is kinnect, KINNECT @gmail.com. And feel free to be in touch with me. And once I have your email, you can be on the mailing list. I send out a little newsletter every once in a while. So those are the ways.
Adoption is not just a destination. It's a journey filled with love, resilience, and growth. Wherever you are on this roadmap, trust in your path, stay open to learning, and always lead with your heart. You already have everything you need to create a beautiful story for your family. And when the road takes unexpected detours, I'm here to help you navigate every turn along the adoption roadmap. Thank you so much for being our guest today.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode of the Adoption Roadmap podcast. If you did, I have a few favors to ask of you. First, please hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And while you're at it, I'd love to hear your takeaways. Please write a review and let me know what you liked. And if you have a question or a suggestion on what you'd like to hear, I'd love to hear that too. Please shoot me an email at support@rgadoptionconsulting.com and let me know what you'd like to hear about. And if you have a question, I may just answer it online. Thanks again for listening. Tune in every Wednesday and Friday morning for a brand new episode of the Adoption Roadmap podcast. Until next time, bye-bye.